It's been almost a month since the M2 MacBook Air was released, and now that the hype has settled down, let's get real. Is it really worth spending way more money on the 14-inch MacBook Pro? Well, today I'm going to compare everything from an honest, real-world perspective and keep it short and sweet. After 5 years, Apple finally redesigned the MacBook Air, and it looks modern but a bit retro at the same time. The 14-inch looks like a chunkier version of the Air, but the extra thickness brings features that can make a real difference in usability. Since I mentioned design, let's start with that. The Pro looks bigger, bulkier, and a bit meaner, where the Air is thin and sleek. The wedge shape is now gone, and personally, I'm a bit sad about it since it was so iconic and it didn't dig into your wrist for really long typing sessions, but in the real world, the new design is still thin enough not to matter. One weird thing is that online, they look very similar and the specs seem so close, but in the real world, you really notice the weight difference and the thickness. I personally find that the thicker Pro can dig into your wrists, and even though the keyboards have the same name, the Air's feels better in my opinion, having a bit more feedback, so if you do a lot of typing, you'll prefer the M2 Air. One disappointment though with the new Air are the speakers. Apple made a huge deal about the quad speakers with dedicated woofers, so we had high expectations, but in reality, they got quieter and with less stereo separation as they got rid of the speaker holes on the sides and instead they fire towards the display. The 14-inch, on the other hand, has the best speakers in any laptop of this size. Go ahead and take a listen. The difference is shocking, with a huge difference in volume and bass, and if you're somebody that will constantly be playing them at full blast, you will really enjoy them. I know I do. Now with that said, if I am being honest, if you are not comparing them side by side, the Air's speakers still sound good, and for most people, they are much better than the laptop that it will replace. With that, we have new ports, which your current laptop may or may not have. Now I love that MagSafe is back on both of these, and on the Air that means that the two Thunderbolt ports are free to use at any time. Now yes, the 14-inch has one more Thunderbolt and it's more powerful, as well as HDMI and a card reader, so if yours has that now, I would track how often you use those things. Now for me, most of the time I just use USB Type-C, and even though dongles suck, you should really ask yourself, is it really worth spending the extra cash to have them built in instead of buying a cheap multi-adapter? I'll link this one in the description. It's been working great and I just keep it in my laptop bag. Now as for the webcams, based on specs, they seem the same, being 1080p, but we definitely noticed a difference. This is the new 1080p webcam in the M2 MacBook Air. Now it did get a lot better compared to the 720p, but the 14-inch MacBook Pro that also has a 1080p webcam has less noise, a bit more detail, so I think it must be just the camera module that Apple is using. After webcams, now is a really good time to talk about fan noise or lack thereof. If you're somebody who constantly does Zoom meetings, and your current laptop might get annoying because after a while the fans will spin up and keep it cool as it processes that video feed, which was a huge issue with the Intel MacBook Air, and that also impacted audio quality. The M2 Air is fanless, so it is silent. But if you might be worried about the 14-inch Pro because it does have dual fans, thankfully for most tasks, the fans are literally turned off thanks to Apple Silicon being very efficient, and since the heat pipes pull away heat from the processors even if the fans are off. Now if you're doing tough tasks, yes, they will spin up, but they are still very quiet. Some people have mentioned that the M2 Air's bottom case can get really hot with extended loads, and that is true. The 14-inch exhausts the heat upwards away from you, but the fanless M2 Air's bottom case can reach 47 degrees Celsius since the heat is literally trapped in there, and up to 108 degrees Celsius internally, which is much hotter than the 14-inch. If you're wondering how this impacts performance without a fan, well, in our detailed testing, we found that it can lose 17 of its performance after about 10 minutes, and that is just with CPU tasks. As far as graphics, the performance loss can be over 26%, and if you're loading both up at the same time, it could be even more than that. So if you're pushing your Mac hard and you're loading up the CPU and the graphics, the Pro is the way to go. But if you need to save some cash and you want a thin and light design, design, a thin laptop cooler can make a surprising difference just by itself. I'll go ahead and link the cooler and the full video in the description. So what about performance, especially if the tasks you do don't completely max out the CPU for a long time? Well, this is the reason why most people would buy the 14-inch Pro instead of the Air, and it might be the biggest reason why you're considering it. Well, I want to challenge you a little bit and also give you some more info. I just want you to take a second and ask yourself, how much performance do you really need? First off, the $2,000 14-inch MacBook Pro is the double bin version, meaning to get the full M1 Pro chip, it costs at least $2,300. And second, even the base M2 Air already beats out even the previous best 16-inch MacBook Pro in many tasks, and it absolutely wipes the floor with the Intel MacBook Airs. In the real world, the Air has more than enough performance for most people, even for difficult tasks, but I do have to add that we are using a 512GB SSD model of the Air because the base 256GB has a slow SSD that will not only slow down transfers, but your whole machine if you are multitasking and doing productive work. Now, the M2 chip sounds like it could be better than the M1 Pro, and it actually can for a few tasks, which I'll mention, but the base 14-inch has 6 performance cores, 2 more than the Air. Because of that, the multi-core score isn't that much higher, with the difference of only 11%, and this test shows a lot of various computing tasks, so most won't even notice it in the real world. As for single core, the M2 beats out the 14-inch by 9% because of its faster clock speeds, which also gives it a good advantage in web-based application performance, but once again, both are so fast that you probably won't notice. What you will notice though is the difference in battery life. Apple specs show that the M2 Air only gets 1 extra hour of battery life, with the fine print showing that it's based on video playback, but that's not the truth for real world use. We found that for mixed use, the battery life is worse and a bigger difference between them, and for tough tasks, the difference is even greater since the 14-inch can use a lot more power. Adding on to that, if you use low power mode, both laptops are still very fast, but the M2 Air can last up to 15 hours because it will only use 2 watts for the CPU and 1.5 for the graphics. That is because it has 4 efficiency cores, and they are new ones that are much more powerful while being more efficient. Now, the 14-inch Pro's battery life doesn't improve too much because it has to keep using the performance cores, as it only has 2 efficiency cores that are much worse. So the CPU actually uses about 15 watts compared to an average of 2. And using that mode on the M2 Air results in the machine running super cool and the bottom not heating up at all. So if you really care about battery life, the MacBook Air is the clear choice. Check out the video if you want to get a lot more info. Now, when you do need full performance for more than 10 minutes, the stock M2 Air loses by about 30% in CPU, and for graphics by more than double because the stock MacBook Air throttles a lot after just 4 to 5 minutes. Now, if you use the cooling solution that we showed, the M2 Air won't throttle, but it's still a 63% difference, which is massive, and spending an extra $100 for better graphics is mostly a waste in our testing. So if you're doing graphics heavy tasks like gaming or productivity tasks that rely on graphics, this is where the 14-inch Pro really starts to stand out, and combining both can make a slightly more pricey 14-inch if spec'd the same, ending up being more than twice as fast and a much better machine to have. But let's get real, most of you wanting the Air probably won't be working on raw footage, but you're gonna be using it for web browsing and some light productivity and maybe some normal creative work. Here, the differences aren't massive, with the 14-inch only being slightly faster for photography. And since both are so fast compared to old Intel MacBooks, in the real world, I had no complaints, especially with the 16GB MacBook Air, which is the one to get if you're gonna be doing productive tasks. And even for things like compiling code, the Air can keep up very well. And for simple 4K video editing with effects, it can actually beat out the 14-inch using the latest version of DaVinci Resolve, which is now fully optimized for the M2 chip. So I would say that there is only a small group of people who really need the extra power of the 14-inch Pro, but when you need it, like for extended 100% loads, especially with graphics, you really need it. And with that comes the mini LED XDR display that is capable of hitting up to 1600 nits instead of 500. Now, for normal use, you don't really notice a difference, but when it comes time for HDR, either viewing or editing, the 14-inch gives you a much better experience with really great contrast and brightness that the M2 Air simply cannot achieve, as well as 120Hz ProMotion for super smooth scrolling, which, to be honest, I didn't notice as much as I do on my iPhone, and also being able to play games at above 60 FPS. Personally, unless you know that you want or need many of the benefits that the 14-inch provides that we talked about, I think that the Air is a great machine and it is much more pleasant for taking on the go. Seriously, it's a big difference. But if you don't mind the size and you can't afford it, you do get a lot more bang for the buck with the 14-inch MacBook Pro, especially if you buy it discounted on Amazon. I will go ahead and leave the best deals down in the video description. Go ahead and check out one of those must-watch videos right over there, especially if you want to buy an M2 MacBook Air, and click above to subscribe if this video brought you some value. This has been Max with Max Tech, and I will see you in the next video.